20 million people live here at the mouth of the Yangtze River in Shanghai, the city that is the pulse of China's economy.
This is the most dynamic place I've ever lived. And it could be the model for the world, or it could be a disaster.
Shanghai is to China what New York is to America, a symbol of success and a warning about the price that may have to be paid.
China isn't just an economic superpower these days, it's a greenhouse gas superpower too. China's now overtaken the US as the principal producer of greenhouse gas emissions.
Shanghai is already beginning to suffer environmental consequences.
台风增多啊，一些龙卷风啊、冰雹啊，甚至一些标线大风等强烈天气都非常的多。
Shanghai could end up underwater. Sea levels are rising, and the city is sinking.
没有对这个未来的这个预测的话，那个每年下沉1.5厘米。
Reducing greenhouse gas emissions will not be enough. China and the rest of the world needs to invest in adapting to climate change.
Without adequate adaptation, there will be probably tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people additionally at risk.
But what can be done to avert the danger, and how much will it cost?
The question, can we afford to deal with climate change, is the wrong question. We can't afford not to. It's adapt or die.
Shanghai is China's gateway to the West. It was East Asia's most important business city before the Second World War. But after the communists took over in 1949, it was deliberately run down. In 1990, that policy was reversed, and the city is booming again. Pudong, the financial center, has all been built in the last 20 years. It has become the hub of one of the fastest economic expansions the world has ever seen. Its success makes the city a driver of climate change. But its low-lying position near the coast means it's also a potential victim. The cost of climate change for China could be the loss of its East Coast industry because of flooding from sea level rises. Yangshan Port, just south of Shanghai, estimated to have cost $12 billion, is just one example of what is at risk.
There are two main ways in which we can combat climate change. One is by reducing emissions of carbon dioxide. We generally call that mitigation. And the other is adapting to the climate changes which are occurring now and will continue to occur and accelerate even if we take the strongest mitigation we can.
China is rich enough to do both. 1,600 kilometers upstream from Shanghai, the newly built Three Gorges Dam helps control the Yangtze River from flooding. It cost $30 billion. But adapting to climate change doesn't always have to be quite so high-tech and expensive. In Surat, a city on the west coast of India, the world's other massive developing economic powerhouse, there is a different low-cost approach.
कीमती चीज कागज पत्र घर की फाइल हो ऐसी चीज हम ऊपर रख देते हैं.
New buildings have empty ground floors. In old buildings, upper floors are being added. And the infrastructure is being adapted to keep the city functioning even when it's flooded. Although the figure is rising, India causes only 5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. China is already responsible for 25%.
China's emissions are growing at around about 10% a year, maybe slightly faster than that. At that rate, they will more than double in a decade. So they're growing much faster than the US. The US is growing 1 to 2% a year. So they're growing almost 10 times the rate of the US at the moment.
China's economy is growing in tandem with massive urbanization. By 2030, 2/3 of China's 1.5 billion people will live in urban areas. In less than 20 years, Shanghai's population has grown by 25%. Hidden in the shadow of Shanghai's new high-rise residential blocks are the homes of many poorer migrants hoping to find a better life. 5 a.m., time for 40-year-old Zhao Wenguan to start his day. He and his wife moved to Shanghai 4 years ago. He was a farmer and a part-time teacher in a village 700 kilometers from Shanghai. He moved here so he could afford the education he wanted for his children. When his children are in the city, they share a room with their parents.
当初来上海的时候是随着这个就是外交人员嘛，就是想出外打工啊。
Mr. Zhao earns his living recycling waste. He uses a tricycle to collect it. He's able to scrape a living as a recycler because Shanghai is at the heart of China's consumer revolution.
Chanel 啊 ，LV 啊，都觉得还可以，包包啊，或者是衣服啊、化妆品啊 ，LV、GUCCI、Burberry。
阿玛尼啊，像运动品牌基本上也很大陆啊，比如说耐克啊、阿迪啊这种，普拉达。
Environmental consultant David Sutton worked for a research institute advising the American government. He left the USA 7 years ago to live in Shanghai.
The Chinese have a very healthy attitude by saving much of the money they have. What money they spend on essentials of living, and ultimately, when they have enough, a home. There is a rising middle class in Shanghai particularly that's chasing the American dream.
因为现在很多新的东西出来都设计得很漂亮，所以应该逛街的次数会增多，所以消费就会多了。
The American dream is going after brand names, status by virtue of the fact that you have what others don't have, buying it whether you have the money or not on credit.
因为我一般就是说，我觉得这件衣服好看的，我就会去买，而不会去考虑它价钱有多少或者怎么样的。
Fashion is just the tip of the iceberg in China's consumer revolution. It is the sale of fridges, washing machines, tumble dryers and air conditioners that's leading to a huge increase in electricity use and produces greenhouse gases.
If China's 1.5 billion people were to consume at the level of the West, there wouldn't be enough resources. It would take 3 planets, and certainly all the oil the world's ever seen, to do that. China cannot follow the model of the West. It can't be done.
People need to adapt their behavior. Ending the throwaway culture would be a good start.
I love to see these recyclers on their bicycles and their little baskets going around picking up things that normally would go in the trash bin, because it represents a value we should never lose, that we can find a way to use most of what we end up throwing away.
China has around 20 million private recyclers like Mr. Zhao. Over 4 years, he has cultivated several regular customers, like this pharmacy. Mr. Zhao buys their spare cardboard boxes. His payment is based on their weight. Mr. Zhao's profit on this transaction will be about 15 cents.
我每天要干这个10多个小时，早上反正天一亮就起来，晚上就是天黑了再回来，就是每天基本上是可以挣到50块钱，就是说1个星期当中没有休息天，就是每天都在干，就是每天都在干这个活。
Before the credit crunch, he used to earn $15 a day, double his current earnings. Rent, water, and electricity bills consume most of his earnings. But because his wife also works, the family just about survives. A car would make his job much easier.
是有点内心深处是有点羡慕，马路上好多汽车，看人家开到多么潇洒，是心里有点羡慕。我就是因为骑这个三轮车是比较辛苦的，要费好大劲。我有时候想买一个便宜一点的这个汽车，来代替这个三轮车，有这个想法，但是暂时是实现不了，但是经济问题。
China has many people like Mr. Zhao, desperate to exchange their bicycles and motorbikes for cars. Although Shanghai is packed with cars, in China as a whole, there are currently only 4 cars per 100 people, compared to 80 per 100 in the USA. Which is great news for Chinese car manufacturers like Geely, the largest privately owned company in the country.
Our domestic sales have gone up a lot, roughly about 50 or more than 50%. This year, everybody's trying to put a gas, whether the volume will be around 2020.
Transport in China is already responsible for 25% of its greenhouse gas emissions, but at the moment, it only has around 70 million cars.
China would have moved to the US situation, you'd have something like 600 to 700 million cars on the road, which is more than 3 times as many cars as there are in the US. That would have a really, really dramatic impact on greenhouse gas emissions if those were all driven by petrol engines.
Adapting to electric cars could reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and boost the green economy. But electric cars are only 1% of the global car market.
If they're going to have a big impact on climate change, then we've got to increase that from 1% to 50% or more. The price has to come down. The technology has to be made really robust. We probably need to improve battery technologies. All of that means that you aren't going to see electric cars taking over the market quickly anywhere, in particular in China.
The Geely mission statement is, make good cars that are the safest, most environment-friendly, and most efficient. But when it comes to electric cars, they're hedging their bets.
I think it will be not a wise idea to force customer to buy something which in reality still takes some time to get a better maturity. That's why for Geely, we are preparing for both. You can just gamble on one side and forget the other side. Then I would say the company will run into an operation risk very quickly.
The current infrastructure is geared to petrol-based cars. Changing to charging stations for electric vehicles is a big challenge. It looks as if gas guzzlers are here for some time, unless governments try to ban them.
That's ridiculous. I wouldn't think any government will do so. And if the other governments wouldn't do so, why Chinese government should do so? That's, unbelievable decisions. You have to be realistic.
Experts say the best hope for electric cars is that they will be 10% of the market by 2030. So Geely are developing solar-powered cars and hybrid technologies, as well as improving the energy efficiency of the fuel-based cars. Mr. Zhao's car ambitions are commendably green.
并且现这个车还不见其现在不有环保车吗？不见其非买这个燃油的或是燃气的这种车，买这种车我认为还可以。
But nothing is as environmentally friendly as pedal power. And electric cars are not the answer if the electricity comes from unsustainable sources. Shanghai's buildings are big, bold, and bright, and burn massive amounts of energy. Whether it's night or day, a boat trip is the best way to see the famous skyline.
Well, they say that 50% of all the building in the world will happen in China in the next 15 years. And a large part of that is here, right here in Shanghai. This has been built in the last 15 years. This entire Pudong 20 years ago, did not exist. And it's happening so quickly that perhaps we can't get control of this juggernaut. What happens here, make or break, not only China, but the rest of the world.
The old, poorer areas of Shanghai can still be seen nestling in amongst the new skyscrapers. Knocking them down and building new blocks is necessary to give these people even a basic standard of living. But making the poorer residents better off is making the world worse off. China's rapid building program is responsible for 20 to 30% of its greenhouse gas emissions. Shanghai leads the world in buildings that have more than 30 floors, and this is only the beginning. The Urban Planning Museum already displays new buildings that will soon be added to the famous skyline. But Shanghai is sinking. It has sunk more than 2 meters since 1921. Geologists blame pumping out too much underground water and the rapid construction of skyscrapers for accelerating the rate at which the city is sinking. These are the kind of problems that urban planners like Professor Xian Nankai have to address.
上海的地面下降速度呢，已经从过去的平均每年下降2.几厘米，也下降到只有1点几厘米了。这个确实也是由于城市规划。
Urban planning has been behind promoting renewable sources of energy, increasing green areas, and cleaning up the city's drinking water.
作为上海来说，很希望把自己的城市成为一个世界上的一个典范的城市。现在上海市政府每年去年投入在环境保护上的总的花费呢是422亿人民币，占整个GDP 的3.08%。
That figure will have to increase because urban planners are expecting the population, which doubled in the last 10 years, to double again in the next 10. For recycler Mr. Zhao, the massive expansion of Shanghai means more waste and more business. On a good day, he can fill up the back of his tricycle at least 3 times. It's Shanghai's mix of wealth and grinding poverty that makes it possible for Mr. Zhao and the other recyclers to help reduce the city's carbon footprint. As China gets further into its stride as a modern economy, the recyclers will find other ways of making money. China's cities generate an average of 120 million tons of garbage a year, and it's growing by 8% a year. In addition to his regular customers, Mr. Zhao uses his bell to attract more business. It accounts for about half his income.
因为这些东西你看看你放在哪里，有一些这烂指头啊，扔到马路上也会够臭的。
For Mr. Zhao, every piece of rubbish is a business opportunity.
我们干这个生意也不是说政府号召，也是我们自发的。
Mr. Zhao is making an important contribution to Shanghai's 2010 Expo. Better city, better life. The aim is to persuade future architects and builders to make their constructions greener.
那么我们在这个新的世博会里面呢，就提供了生态的城市，节能的城市，那个环保的城市，以及更美好的城市的一个理念。希望通过这次世博会呢，来引导上海的城市建设，来引领世界城市的发展潮流。
But that vision of the future is threatened by what is going on now.
Shanghai is throwing up big buildings at an incredible rate, and unfortunately they're building them to somewhat old-fashioned energy efficiency standards. And that means that 50 years from now, when those buildings are still operating, they'll be using a lot more energy than they will really need, and that'll be boosting greenhouse gas emissions.
Inefficient buildings can be made more efficient. This building was constructed in 1996. It would be very expensive to change the shell now. But on the 26th floor, Shu On Development Limited have recently refurbished their offices to be as green as possible. Architect Michael Kwok helped design a range of energy-saving ideas. For example, the light levels in the open plan area change according to the level of light outside. If it's not enough, there's always the traditional desk lamp with energy-saving bulbs. A control panel monitors CO2 levels in the office, and energy is saved by supplying less fresh air to empty meeting rooms. As a result, energy consumption has fallen by 25%.
The cost of the renovation is just less than 1% more than what you would normally do in a typical office fit-out. This minimal investment will be able to have the return within 3 to 5 years.
Building from scratch is even more cost efficient.
If you consider green building or sustainable development in the very beginning of a design process, it actually costs you nothing. We're talking about natural daylight, natural ventilation, those are free.
But property developers have little incentive to construct greener buildings. As soon as they're finished, they sell them, and any profits from cheaper running costs go to the new owners. Shanghai's buildings may be costing the earth, but they're certainly a tourist attraction. Tourists are scared to step from a solid floor onto the glass. They're perfectly safe, but this building, the Pearl Orient, and all the others in Pudong are at risk. They're all built on low-lying ground that has been reclaimed from the sea. Each year, Shanghai adds 3,000 hectares of new territory this way. The danger is that sea level rise could cause the land to return to being underwater. The war against climate change will be fought on many fronts. Finding the means and the money to adapt will be critical. Coming up in part 2, countries like India show the way forward in low-cost, practical solutions. Surat, with a population of nearly 4 million, is the 9th largest city in India. And it's proving that to prepare for floods does not have to be high-tech or expensive. Flooding has long been a fact of life in Surat. It's such a regular event, each of the city's districts has 2 rescue boats. They're flat-bottomed, so they skim easily across the water, missing obstacles just below the surface. As Surat has had floods 15 to 20 feet deep, this could mean a house is under the boat. The floods are caused when monsoon rains swell the river Tapi running through the city and the surrounding tidal creeks. Many people have drowned over the years. This rescue mission is just an exercise. Every year before the monsoon rains arrive, rescue teams practice their techniques. But it's not just river flooding that threatens Surat. Houses have been abandoned as the sea moves inland due to coastal erosion. The city faces a pincer movement because flooding also comes from inland. "94 kilometers away is the Ukai Dam. It was built in the 1970s to protect the city from flooding, to provide water for irrigation, and generate electricity. The dam fills with water during the rainy season, which can be released to prevent drought in the dry season. But due to climate change, the dam is filling unpredictably, and when that water is released, it poses a serious threat.
Under the changed climate scenario, the rainfall is likely to increase. dominated by extreme events. If any one of these extreme events happen during the end of the rainy season, when the dam is full, the dam will not be able to protect Surat.
When the dam is too full, the water has to be released, and within 6 hours, floods Surat. In 2006, unexpected downpours at the end of the rainy season meant the dam water had to be released with very little warning, but with drastic consequences. The water was 15 to 20 feet deep, and slums close to the river, like this one, were almost completely submerged. Up to 14,000 families live close to the riverbank. The municipal commissioner is responsible for the welfare of the slum dwellers. One shows her how high the water reached.
They were saying that in the last floods, the entire house was submerged. And the floods before that, that was about 4 years ago, it was about like half the height of the house that was submerged.
But it's not just exceptional floods that affect this slum.
Every year when there are floods, this area is inundated and there's about water to the depth of 2 feet or so, which is a great hardship for the people living here. And water also enters into their houses, so they have to be evacuated and taken to relief camps.
These floods are a disaster for the economy as well as individuals. Surat's also known as the city of diamonds and silk. The diamond industry here is worth $14 billion. 65% of the world's diamonds are polished here. The 2006 flood cost the diamond industry $2 billion.
Because of flood, mainly the workers who are staying in a low-lying area, their houses were totally washed away. And because of that, they could not report to their job.
Surat has virtually no unemployment. 1 million people, a quarter of the population, work in the diamond industry. Although the floods only lasted 4 or 5 days, business in the city closed down for up to 60 days while workers struggled to repair their homes. Closures also devastated the textile business. 70% of the looms had to be replaced. At this diamond factory, one very practical adaptation was in place.
નીચેના જે માળો હોય અથવા નીચે ગ્રાઉન્ડ ફ્લોરમાં જે મશીનરી રાખીએ છીએ મોંઘી મશીનરી જે છે કોસ્ટલી મશીનરી એ બધીને ઉપર રાખવી.
And there are plans to make sure that in the future, machines are not so vulnerable.
We have, like a submersible units. The machines, do not get affected. The motors do not get affected. So this kind of technology should be brought into the city.
But the most important change is making sure workers have houses that will survive heavy flooding so that the city doesn't have to close down for so long. This family moved to Surat from 200 kilometers away. Over 20 years, they have continued to make improvements to their house.
ऐसा मालूम नहीं था पहले इधर बाढ़ आता है, ऐसा मालूम नहीं था. लेकिन वो 88 में हम जब इधर आए ना, तो 2 साल के बाद बाढ़ चालू हो गया. तो जब पानी आता था तो पूरा सामान हमारा बह जाता था.
ऐसा कोई आटा पाटा पानी सब बिगड़ जाता है.
काम धंधा भी जाता है, बीमार पड़ते हैं. तो साफ सफाई में इसमें बहुत तकलीफ, मतलब 1 महीना तो ऐसा ही निकल जाता है.
The family doesn't want to move to a safer area further away. Being close to work is a priority. So adapting their existing house is essential. At first it was simple things like high shelves.
ऐसे अमूल्य अगर पैसा डागी ना हो तो उसको कहीं ऊपर के साइड में रखना पड़ता है. ऊपर कोई है वो अपनी पर्दी बनाया है या अभराई हो, ऐसी जगह में हम रख देते हैं व्यवस्थित.
The family raised the level of their floor several times. When they could afford it, added another story. Flood levels are marked all over the city. No one escapes, so people are doing their best to adapt. Shops have raised fronts. Street lamps have their electrical supply box fixed well above high water levels. this slum has been raised up. And these old houses each have a high plinth. And in newer houses, the ground floor is kept empty. Weep holes all over the city help with drainage. Even the rich are at the mercy of flooding and have high plinths and weep holes to protect themselves. Surat is also adapting other aspects of its infrastructure. The fresh water supply is at risk during flooding, but it's been designed so clean water can easily be rerouted if any of the processing or distribution plants go down. As a result, the 2006 flood caused much less disease than expected. This sewage treatment plant has been constructed to keep working through a flood. It's powered by biogas, which is gas produced from the sewage itself. It means even if the power supply is cut in a flood, the sewage can still be processed. This plant is cheaper to run and helps reduce CO2 emissions, which in turn help reduce global warming. And Surat has plans for future adaptation. This sign tells the people what level the water is at in the dam. But those managing the dam need more accurate weather predictions so they can release the water in the dam over a slower period.
Surat will require extensive use of IT to actually predict, provide early warning systems, and manage the events better.
The Indian government is asking for technological help from the industrialized world. But if scientists are right, the time to make these adaptations may be running out.
Increasingly, the scientific monitoring of the Earth's surface is throwing up this evidence that climate change is occurring now, that it's occurring faster than we thought, that it's going to accelerate faster than we previously thought in the future, and that large numbers of people may be being affected now, and that number will become very large in the next few decades, not the next few centuries.
The speed of change puts cities all over the world at risk. Even existing flood structures like London's Thames Barrier could become obsolete.
Well, the UN thinks that adaptation will cost about $100 billion a year by 2030. I and several others think that that's an underestimate, perhaps 2 or 3 times too low. But this Thames barrage alone would cost $1 billion to replace.
It is already too late to save some places from damage caused by climate change.
Some estimates are in the order of 1/3 to 2/3 of the total global impact is something it would not be worth adapting to. Even if we could, it would cost too much. It would make more sense to pull out.
Shanghai is built on a river delta close to the sea, and water levels have already risen nearly 12 centimeters in the last 30 years.
A rise in sea level of only a few feet would put a lot of Shanghai underwater.
An estimated $800 million is being spent raising 1,000 kilometers of sea and river dikes by about 2 meters, so the average height is now 9 meters. The Shanghai Flood Control Center was established in 1951. 32 screens give live information about weather, rainfall, drainage, and emergencies. Flooding has always been a problem, but climate change is increasing its severity and frequency. Deputy Director Zhang Zhenyu has no illusions about the challenges ahead.
那么这什么概念呢？就是我们上海的一个排水的能量，它每小时只有36毫米。但如果超过100毫米的话，那么就会对我们的城市的一个防汛产生很大的影响，特别是对我们道路上会出现积水。那么一些民众的家里也可能在短时间会出现积水。
These screens monitor sea levels, and they're rising. The only debate is by how much.
那么我们预测到2050年的时候，上海的海平面会上升21厘米左右。吴淞口外建造一座水闸来抵挡这些不断上升的一个海平面带来的天文高潮的影响。等等这些措施，我们经过科学论证以后啊，就会马上的逐步实施的。
I think a 20 centimeter rise by 2050 is a very optimistic scenario. That's the best possible case scenario. There's a lot of argument about the science at the moment. But by planning on a 20 centimetre rise by 2050, Shanghai leaves itself exposed to significant losses.
But Shanghai's flood control experts are confident about the future.
所以我们这些年来，政府都非常的重视，都能够把确保人民生命财产安全作为我们的一个出发点。那比如说像我们为完善四道防线，每年都会投入了大量的资金，但是我们相对于这个来说，如果我们灾害受到损失的话，可能会更大。
Increase in the frequency and severity of China's typhoons is already having an impact on Mr. Zhao's business.
下雨天对社会肯定有影响，就是说有时候雨下的大，就是不适合拉的东西都不能拉了。你像纸板呀这些，就是水一类的，都基本上都不想拉。要是铁呀、金属一类的也可以，塑料一类可以。
Mr. Zhao is aware of the larger consequences of the success of his business. There's more rubbish for him to collect because the Chinese are buying more goods. Increased consumption leads to more greenhouse gases and ultimately to global warming.
地震，你像上海今年出现130多年没出现过的40度的高温，这都能感觉到的，就说明全球温度是在上升，气候在无常的变化，给这个废品都。
Scientists argue adaptation to climate change must go hand in hand with action to reduce global warming.
It's important that mitigation is implemented soon and substantially. Otherwise, it's quite possible that we drive climate change to a level and a magnitude that exceeds our capacity to adapt.
Yet China is building 1, perhaps 2 coal-fired power stations a week.
Chinese power consumption is growing very rapidly. The economy is growing at about 8 or 9% a year, and energy consumption is growing more like 10, 12% a year.
If the Chinese are using oil at the same rate as America by 2030, they will want 100 million barrels of oil a day. Today, oil producers churn out just 84 million barrels a day.
Could be almost 40% of world emissions by 2020, 2025, which is a dramatic thought. The reason for this is that the main source of energy in China is coal. They are very well endowed with lots of coal. It's cheap coal, but it's very inefficient coal, very low quality coal. So when you burn this, you produce a lot of pollution, including a lot of greenhouse gases.
70% of China's energy comes from coal and 20% from oil. Hydroelectric power is the third biggest source, but accounts for only 6%. Other renewable sources of power are currently less than 1%.
If they're going to get renewable energy up to something like, say, 20% of total energy supplies within the next 10 to 20 years, which is the sort of goal that the US has set for itself, for example, they probably would have to invest between 1 and 2% of the total output, total GDP, in renewable energy every year for the next 10 to 15 years.
Some of these costs could be offset by exporting the technology of new green industries.
If they're really successful in building up a world-dominating solar panel industry and a world-dominating turbine industry, and they're a big player in the electric automobile market, say 20, 30 years from now, they might be able to offset a third to a half of that cost.
Shanghai at night is a symbol of the success of China's rapid industrialization. Chinese energy policy seems to be ensuring a bright future. The goal is that by 2020, every unit of output will be produced with 20% less energy than today.
The central government has the power to set these goals, but it doesn't always have the power to enforce them. A lot of the enforcement power lies with provincial governments. Provincial governments, provincial governors are really quite powerful in China. The provinces are big, so the provincial governor is like the president of a quite a biggish country, really. And these guys have a lot of economic power. So they really have to be persuaded to adopt these goals. And they tend to take a fairly short-term view of economic issues.
Mr. Zhao is finally on his way with his day's booty to the recycling station. First, he has to sort the rubbish into categories like cardboard and plastic. He has no illusions about his job.
因为这个事情在整个社会当中也不是算很火的一个职业，人都想往好的方面去发展。
But Mr. Zhao likes the fact that he's his own boss.
我有展望呀，我想今后晚年能够痛痛快快的过一生。至于目标吧，主要是培养自己孩子，把孩子培养成才。还有一个就是，咱尽量对社会对各方面不做有害的事情，对别人对其他人，咱争取就是能够发展自己，也不能妨碍别人，也不能损害别人，这样。
Mr. Zhao gets paid about $7 a day. After 10 hours trawling the streets, he heads home. For all its hectic pace and speed, Shanghai has another, more human side. The parks, especially on Sundays, are packed with all kinds of activity.
I see community here. I see something that they do every day, they're used to, they're energetic, they're involved in activity together with their neighbors. It's a very large extended family. It's a great place for recreation for the young people, as well as retired people.
The Chinese government may not be a democracy, but to maintain power, it can't afford unrest. So like the West, if investment in climate change is not to be piecemeal, they will need the sanction of their citizens.
People don't understand the threat posed by climate change. And there is a real risk, actually, of runaway climate change if we do nothing to control climate change, with temperatures increasing as much as 6 or 7 or 8%. And, in that case, you could really almost see the end of civilization as we know it today. And if sea level were to rise 200 feet, for example, that would have a traumatic effect on existing civilizations. I mean, most major cities in the world would be wiped out.
The true costs of preventing this kind of disaster are only being guessed at.
Stopping climate change isn't necessarily cheap. It costs a couple of % of output, but it's a good buy, taken in the long run, because the costs you save are much, much greater.
Questions about affording climate change prevention are being raised all over the globe.
Questions like that aren't asked when a country wants to build a new weapon system or have a new war. Nobody says, can we afford to do it? No, they've decided to do it. They find the money to do it. We have a war here. We have a war against misguided, non-adaptive practices that are killing us all.
China is already responsible for 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. As it continues to industrialize, this figure is predicted to rise to 40% in less than 10 years. As a result, the whole world is dependent on how China responds to the threat of global warming.
The simple fact is, China cannot develop as the West has. We need 3 planets of resources to do that. The good news is China knows that. And I do believe they'll do alternatives that'll be good for them and the rest of the world. We just cannot afford to not change. We must adapt or die.
In the next episode of Hot Cities, the sprawl of Los Angeles, a city built around the motor car. But LA's energy binge will have to end soon. Is climate change turning the Hollywood dream into a nightmare?